Remember, we had a lot of assumptions when discussing consumer behavior. It is time for new assumptions now for discussing producer behavior. Most important is this. We will begin a study of how firms make decisions by assuming that they do so in perfectly competitive markets. Now, this is completely imaginary, and such perfect markets most likely do not exist anywhere. What is this perfect market or a perfectly competitive market? Three conditions characterize such perfectly competitive markets. 1. No buyer or seller is big enough to influence the market price. 2. Sellers in the market produce identical goods. 3. There is free entry and exit in the market. Let's take an example to illustrate these assumptions. Imagine I go to a vegetable vendor's market. Our farmer, Chandra, is there to sell his wheat. Now observe the vegetable market. There are so many vendors and none of them are big enough to change the market price or influence the market. And all of them produce identical products. Cabbage of one vendor is the same as anyone else's. What will happen if any of them change their prices? Let's say increases them. Let us say Chandra hikes the price of wheat from 60 to 70, whereas the market price is only 60 rupees. Remember the concept of substitution? Chandra's wheat and others' wheat are perfect substitutes as far as me, the consumer, is concerned. So how will the consumers like me react? I'll just go to another vendor who's still selling at the market price of 60. What happens to Chandra? He will get zero revenue since all his customers will substitute away from him. So he cannot change from the market price. He has to accept it. He has to take it. Which is why all producers in a perfectly competitive market are called price takers. They have to take the price prevailing in the market. How that market price is determined, we will see later once we have more tools to investigate how the market functions. For now, we will take price as a given and analyze how producers behave. The third assumption was free entry and exit, which means that in case there's a lot of profit to be made, maybe due to a shift in demand from the consumer side, more vendors can easily set up a stall in the market so that the profits immediately come down by being distributed among all of them. Only when there are no restrictions such as high costs or regulatory requirements to entry and exit. Consider the telecom industry. Can a new player enter easily? The initial costs of entry are too high. Exit costs are also too high because exit will mean all the initial investments are wasted. What about the doctor profession? There are regulatory restrictions that you need to have certain qualifications to practice as a doctor. So again, there is no free entry. Perfect market assumptions assume that such things that restrict free entry and exit just do not exist. So those are our assumptions. Of these, the first two are very important because they ensure that the agents in this type of market are price takers. Just as a consumer like Crusoe is a price taker by buying as much as he is willing at the market price if he has enough money, sellers in perfectly competitive markets like Chandra are also price takers. That is, they can sell as much as they are willing to at the market price. Now that we have the base of these assumptions, let's start analyzing part 1 of our investigation into producer behavior. Making the goods, how inputs are turned into outputs. We know that the ultimate and the obvious goal of the seller is to maximize net benefits or profits. The seller's problem therefore revolves around the question, how do firms decide what and how much to produce? We just frame this question as a problem, the seller's problem, just as when we looked at the buyer's problem in the last chapter and discussed how consumers make buying decisions. Think of the pizza shop owned by Rohit. How does he run it? He first buys the ingredients, then employs some people and some machines and produces a pizza with dough, sauce and toppings. And finally, he lists it on the menu for selling it in the market. Now consider the seller's problem from Rohit's perspective. It has three main components. First, he must know how the inputs combine to make the outputs. For example, how many tomatoes are necessary for just the right sauce, how much dough is required, how many people are required to work on it, what machines like the oven etc. are required, etc. Second, he must know how much it costs to produce a pizza. For instance, how much does the oven cost? And what about the electricity cost and the workers' wages, etc.? And does it matter that new ingredients need to be purchased each time he produces a pizza while the oven sits ready for use? Finally, he must know how much he can sell the pizza for once it is produced, and also decide how many pizzas he should produce per day to avoid shortages or wastages. If he makes too many, it will be a waste. If he makes too less, he misses out on potential revenue, right? Let's define some of our key terms now. A firm is a business entity or an economic agent that produces and sells goods or services. It can consist of thousands of people, a few people, or a single person. A firm converts factors of production into goods and services. In the process, firms make numerous decisions, including what to produce, how much to produce, what inputs to produce, and what technology to use to produce their product. There are thousands of other decisions firms make as well, including where to advertise, how much money to dedicate to research, when to innovate, and where to locate, etc. But many of these decisions involve intricacies that are beyond the scope of our discussion right now. We will therefore discuss only the general theory of how firms make decisions. Production is the process by which the transformation of inputs such as labor and machines etc. to outputs such as goods and services occurs. The relationship between the quantity of inputs used and the quantity of outputs produced is called the production function. Every firm faces the decision of how to combine inputs to create outputs. We can represent the production process like this. Inputs are acquired by the firm. The firm incurs costs for these inputs and for the production process itself. The output created are then sold in the market to create revenue for the firm. So this figure is essentially the microeconomist view of what the firm does. A firm, for a microeconomist, is anything that does this function of creating outputs from inputs, incurring cost with the expectation of profits. Our diagram clearly tells us that outputs need inputs. But what are these inputs? In economics, we call the inputs the factors of production. And broadly speaking, in economics, we say that there are 4 key factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Let's understand them in a bit of detail now. First, land. Land in economics is basically all the natural resources directly available from nature. So land itself, oil and such resources, timber, etc. are all considered as land. So land is what is directly available for use from nature without modification. Land itself is also without doubt an important factor of production. Land costs can be significant and important to the firm, taking up the greater fraction of operating costs for businesses in some cases, as we saw when we discussed the Starbucks mystery, and how rent costs are an important part of the overall costs. Owners of land are called landowners, and the cost of using land is rent. Second is labor. The human element of production is labor, usually denoted L in equations. The firm hires labor by paying wages, W, to the workers who do the work. Thus, the total a firm pays out in labor cost is W times L or WL. A few assumptions here as well. To begin with, economists assume that workers are indistinguishable and undifferentiated, and each individual makes the same contribution to output. So we assume that workers are neither hardworking nor shirkers, and that all workers are the same. Third is capital. Labor is important, but workers can't create an output on their own without at least some equipment. The farmers need the farming equipments, the pizza workers need the various tools in the pizzeria, the factory workers need many complicated machinery, and even other workers like carpenters etc. need their woodworking tools. Therefore, labor has to be combined with this other factor of production, capital. Capital is in fact anything that can be used to produce either more capital or goods. There are two types we can classify capital into. Tangible, which includes physical capital such as machines and plant equipment, and intangible, which includes brand value and knowledge and skills embodied in the firm. Skills are sometimes called human capital for this reason, as we'll see in a later chapter in a later module. In each case, the capital plus labor together makes the output, and so capital is generally held to be useless on its own. The cost of capital is called interest or R. Why interest? Because capital is considered as an investment. So the cost of capital is basically the cost of money. And as we'll see later, the cost of money is the interest or R. And hence, the assumption is that the money invested in capital is measured in terms of interest. And it also covers the opportunity cost of doing something else with that money. If R goes up, then investment by firms fall. Because if the firm has to borrow money to increase its use of capital at a higher cost of borrowing, the firm effectively has to spend more money to invest in the capital it wants. If the firm is investing its own money, then a higher cost of capital implies that the opportunity cost of investing is higher, and that a firm wants higher returns of capital to compare with the other opportunities available. Therefore, the firm is likely to use less capital in such cases. Last is entrepreneurship. These three factors are the basic inputs. But if we just take some land, some labor, and some machines and put them next to each other, will a car or a pizza come out? No. Someone has to organize them, decide what to produce, take the risk of producing it, and then make revenue out of it. That is the role of the entrepreneur. Which is why economists like to think of entrepreneurship and even talent as a factor of production. Entrepreneurship differs from the other factors of production like land, labor, and capital by being concerned more with seeing the opportunity to create a firm or a product, or somehow finding a way for creating value. A firm may need to buy talent at great expense, particularly if it's rare. But talent can also be a collective phenomenon, something that comes from a great number of people working together or embodied in one entrepreneur who has the gift of this insight.